I think each of us is going to introduce ourselves. My name is Angela, and I'll be the moderator. I work with Elevate, and we're an advisory firm helping companies get through every audit under the sun. Our distinguished panel is here today, and I'm going to start from further for me, Matt, to introduce himself, and then follow in the order. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Matt Shea. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for MixMode. We're a AI-powered threat detection, real-time, at-scale company, and love to talk a little bit more about all the details of what's going on, especially in AI. I think what we need now is a lot more hype around AI. I think everyone would really appreciate that. So anyway, that's a joke. Go ahead.
I'm Gary Hutchins. I'm a principal engineer with SysDig. We're focused on cloud-native security application. And
I'm Chris Hatter. I do double duty. I'm an operating partner at Number One AI, where we are building the next generation of AI companies. And I'm also the CISO of Quiet AI, which is application security. And I am super pumped to be here post RSA week. This is a good, interesting regional conference, and I think it's awesome that we were invited here to speak. So thank you.
Good morning, Robert Grillo, Vice President and CIO here at FIU.
Great, thank you. So what is our subject here? Securing the future of AI in business. Tips and strategies to ensure privacy and security. But I think to start, like any good panel, is let's level set. So let's just chat about AI. What are some of the current uses and what are we seeing? And I know a lot of people know here, but it's a good way to get started and go into the weeds a little further. So let's start with you, Matt. Thank you.
Sure. I think it's helpful to understand that there's different categories of AI, or this term artificial intelligence. We've had the ability to classify things with detection, things that would be like Siri with voice recognition, image recognition, things like that. We've had those for a while. We've had curation has been a category, things like Facebook and Amazon and recommendation engines, things that we don't normally think of when we use that term AI. It was actually John McCarthy, the originator of the term AI, who said, once it's working, we're going to stop calling it AI, which is pretty common, right? We just refer to things based on what they work. All of this bleeding edge discussion around AI is just because we don't know how to use it yet. The last category, or the more recent one, would be creation, right? Or also something called generative AI. One thing to understand is folks are using ChatGPT as synonymous with generative AI. And if there's just one thing I could give you is that category is much bigger than what ChatGPT does. It's using something called the large language model. And so from us as providers, from you as far as consumers are concerned, it's time to click down a level and understand a little bit more about what these different categories are and what's good for what. We don't say we just go out and buy software. We don't use a spreadsheet to run a website. It's time to understand what things are good at. Large language models are very good at consuming language and producing things that look like they could be created by a human, but they're doing it with confidence, but there's really not necessarily an understanding under the hood. And so that eloquence is really creating a lot of confusion. Under generative AI, there's other categories, things that can create images, things that can create movies. Our role being able to stand up a alerting for, something that would normally take an expert weeks to do. That's really the idea, right? Generally speaking, on the road, we call it the AI drinking game, which is, can you have a conversation without saying the word AI? And if you do it, you got to take a drink, right? It actually gets to the heart of the matter, just waving your hands and saying AI is no longer good enough. And you should demand more from folks to understand what are things good at, what are they not good at. And so that's been, I think, the thing that's resonated is being able to explain why this fundamental approach, foundational model for that, all these terms that we can get into, what they're good at and what they're not good at.
And to dovetail into that, I think we also have to understand that there's the consumption of AI, like ChatGPT, which is a large language model, and the AI use of in tooling. We have to be very sensitive and aware of the fact that there's different use cases and different protection models based upon, am I consuming it as an endpoint or am I consuming it within my tool chains? So understanding that nuance, not only what the AI model is, but how I'm applying that AI model. Those really impact how I approach security and how I approach making sure my applications and that intelligence is doing what I need it to do.
But some of that, I feel like it's being defined already, right? So you're going to use clustering model for certain types of things versus you're going to use a random forest, which are different types of models for like fishing or something like that. So I think sometimes what people don't know is what is that, right? What is the model? How is it used? What are the use cases? Can somebody speak a little bit about this? Because I think that's important. That's obviously the machine learning and data scientist kind of job, the data and the model. But I think it's important for people to understand the model's usage, so then they understand when they're seeing a tool, oh, that's what it's doing.
Sure, I'll start there. I think it brought up in the keynote earlier that ChatGPT is a great social engineering attack model.
Yep.
So I would protect myself differently when I'm trying to protect against a ChatGPT attack versus I've got somebody running ChatGPT in my code, or I'm actually doing deep learning models from a multiple attack vector threat conversation. So I've got multiple different data points coming in, aggressively looking at that, because ChatGPT takes time to learn those things. Large language models are not applicable to active attack situations. So I have to be very cognizant of what that looks like.
Yeah, makes sense.
I'd add a couple other things. If you just look around the room here at the vendors just sitting in this room, most of these organizations have some form of artificial intelligence or machine learning. And if they're not deployed in production, they're all in the midst of trying to figure out what they are. I could give just a couple of examples. I was actually a former customer of Silence over there when I was the CISO at Nielsen, and everything that they're doing was all about going from a signature-based model of just already determining what good and bad were, but they couldn't, or the industry couldn't be predictive about a new file and knowing what was good or bad. And they took the whole industry by storm. And that was a predictive AI model that they were able to really change the entire AV and EDR space. With my own company at Quiet AI, we're focused on building graph neural networks to be able to identify vulnerabilities in code with a much higher degree of speed and accuracy, because everyone knows that space is absolutely plagued by false positives. So really everyone in here is in the midst of implementing some sort of forward deployed machine learning models to support their organization.
Makes sense. So let's get into kind of the meat and potatoes of the discussion, which is tips and strategies to ensure privacy and security. But first, let's understand what are the risks and vulnerabilities, right? So in today's world, what are some of the things that are coming out already, the nefarious aspects of this, and how do companies protect themselves?
Sure, I'll answer that. I think it's fair to say that ChatGPT is probably going to be the mother of all supply chain attacks and the father of all IP breaches. You can't have something that's adopted as quick as it has been, and we had some examples from prior talks this morning about companies putting their intellectual property in it and expecting it to fix code and then taking that code. This supervised or reinforcement learning approach, going back to the models, the fact that it's trained off of the entire corpus of the internet is not necessarily a great thing. It's not going to be difficult for someone to figure out a way to say, when someone asks, let's say, a Python script that backs up files, why don't you just go ahead and put this little line of code in there the same way that they did with SolarWinds, but with much more effect. So that's a concerning aspect of how IT organizations are going to utilize it. And then, again, more examples by the day. I think even this morning or last night, there was ChatGPT itself was breached. We've been talking a little bit about AI in cybersecurity, but now as you're asking, how do we have cybersecurity for AI? And we've had customers ask us, what do we need to do with regards to a risk management framework and policies? I think the one thing to highlight is that you're not going to be able to stop the adoption of it. Right. I saw an article about how teachers were protesting calculators 40 years ago or whatever it was. They didn't want them in school. This is going to happen. So you need to have the right approach in order to minimize the risk and be able to train your employee pool in order what's going to work, what's not going to work, and also through the lens of FIU here, how do we teach students to have that as a core competency out of the gate?
Yeah, and along the same lines of this is going to happen, it's like a snowball rolling down a hill. But for me, it has always felt very similar to when public cloud was exploding, right? In those very early days, at least from a security practitioner perspective, people were confused, didn't really understand how to secure it, and we're all trying to cook up ideas like, how do I release a new policy to protect data that goes to the cloud or that's going to Dropbox or Box? And the reason, and the thing that gives me a little bit of comfort as we go into this big wave of protecting AI and ML in our organizations, is that at a very fundamental level, machine learning models are software, and training and validation data sets are data. So hopefully, everyone in this room, your policies have coverage over data security and how to secure your data assets, and have an SDLC set of policies to make sure that you're safeguarding what you build. I think what fundamentally changes is the way you think about threat modeling. There's new and different types of attacks that could be applied to AI and machine learning models that you are developing within your organization that you really need to think about. You need to think about things like, how do I prevent against data poisoning or evasion or model inference attacks, these types of things. That's what's, to me, is really the newness. And just a little piece of advice for everyone, I would say that instead of really wrapping a lot of your time around, okay, how do I change my existing security policy at my company, think about how you change your standards and guidelines and the way you educate your employees about AI and machine learning, both from a in a build capacity, your organization is actually building those models, but also the consumption of AI that's out there. And that's what's been really lighting the world on fire, is all the large language models and Chat-4. Those are two different ways to think about the problem.
It makes complete sense. And Robert, I wanted, you're here in a university. It's becoming very controversial in universities. My husband's a professor at the university. He was telling me about some interesting things that are happening with ChatGPT, like students even writing the letters about how you shouldn't give me silly stuff like that. But what's going to be, in your mind, some of the, in your industry, the things that you guys are talking about and thinking about in chat, and not just ChatGPT, but in general in this topic?
Yeah, I think technology in general has challenged higher ed and higher education universities. ChatGPT is just one example of that. Obviously, when it actually became prevalent, we basically got a lot of pressure from faculty and other administrators to have a position on this, right? And having a position on this at an institutional level is a little bit challenging because it really depends on the course, the class, and what you're trying to develop from a curriculum perspective. We have faculty that embrace it. We have faculty that basically want to block it. And we have faculty that really don't know what to do with it. Plagiarism obviously is a great example. There's already applications out there that are detecting AI-generated type of requirements. There's one that's pretty famous that we all use called Turn It In. As soon as that actually came out, I got more emails from students than I did on faculty because they were like, why are we doing this? I think in this space, if you're not on the app dev side, you probably want to figure out how you get onto the cyber policy side, because I think there's a lot to do on the maturity level there. And institutions like FIU, we do have data stewardship policies. We have other policies, but this is just a growing area that we really need some help and some expertise to put some guidance around it. You're not going to basically say, thou shalt not do this, but at least to provide, and I think Chris mentioned, some of the educational aspect to teach people on how to consume it, either in the classroom or outside the classroom.
Yep, thank you. And then going back a little bit to the discussion of the threat landscape is different in how it's happening. Can you guys chime in on MITRE, Atlas, and NIST and other frameworks out there, and for people that may know about them, so we could share information in those regards?
Sure, I'll kick off that one. If anybody doesn't understand MITRE, it is basically a framework you were talking about. And as we transition to more of policy-driven frameworks, MITRE Atlas is going to be the new evolving construction around how I deal with AI. And it's a multifaceted policy. If you look at it, it's not around this, set this control for this endpoint, set this thing for this. It is a philosophical, different way of protecting yourself and your organization. And understanding exactly to what you said, that is going to be a fundamental shift in how we do things in the security models. And I think that's really an important context.
One thing I could add, and for any of you that deal with federal, state, NIST actually just developed, I think, their version that came out for AI risk management framework. And you're not going to find all the answers there, but it talks about your risk tolerance, governance, and the trustworthiness, just about what you're doing. And I think that if you are going to start to do this or engage with these types of applications, you got to have your privacy, your security officer, your compliance officer. And it's a good first step to developing something to create the awareness on how you're actually going to deploy this in the operations. Again, I guess we follow it. If you're in the world of audit, the auditors love to basically follow a framework, and this is a pretty popular one. I encourage you to take a look at it.
So I love MITRE Atlas, by the way, and I'll try to bring this kind of full circle. When you think about creating policies, guidelines, and standards, I think of Atlas as a really solid knowledge base. I think there's a misconception out there that in the field of AI and ML, to be valuable and to contribute to it and to help secure your organizations, you need to be some sort of data scientist or a deep technical expert. And I fundamentally don't think that that's true at all. I think you can use things like Atlas, the NIST frameworks, and you could use that to educate yourself and give yourself a good base of understanding for how these things work. And the professionals in this room, we think about risk all day, right? You don't have to be the one writing the model to understand what kind of risk might exist for your organization. And my feedback on Atlas is read it cover to cover. There's actually one of the most valuable pieces of it. It's not only just like talking about the techniques of how these attacks work. There's real world case studies that I found really valuable. When I try to make this real in my brain as someone who's not, a deep data scientist, but has been around data science companies before, the use cases are what make things real for me. And so I would say it's just such a phenomenal resource to go out and educate yourself and help use that to inform your next steps on how to prepare your organization for this.
I probably should add the question before, but are you guys familiar with MITRE Atlas? Raise a hand here. Okay. No, I think
there's
that's
a lot
good.
of reading. There's a lot of opportunity.
I think we're all becoming, and honestly, I'm in this industry and I look at the stuff from an audit, governance, compliance, and I'm like, okay, we need to know this. And we all need to become experts now in understanding this. Also, NIST has issued some, not a framework yet. They're trying to get their arms around it too. So there's some really good papers out there from NIST that I highly recommend. And in that NIST framework, it expands to the privacy aspects because there's going to be there's already regulatory requirements related to this. New York has a law for AI bias, and people are getting tested. These models are being tested for bias. But anyways, I'm not gonna go in the weeds, but there's a lot of good information there. I know one of the things that we talked about a little bit was when we met, because obviously we've met before, so we are cohesive here, is you mentioned something, Chris, about how AI and ML is going to make it better for the defender, but it's just also increasing the speed of the attacker. Can we talk about this, what's coming or what's here that's going to be normal for everybody in the near future?
Yeah, so I'll try to use some real examples of where I think this is headed. You raise your hand if you're familiar with GitHub Copilot by chance? Okay, so we have a couple, and then how about Auto GPT? Okay, so still a handful. In the Copilot example, a lot of these LLMs and certainly Copilot, these things are like ultra powerful, basically autocompletes. People are familiar with autocomplete as you write your email, it autocompletes the rest of the code. In the development and the engineering space, Copilot can, in my opinion, help turn what I would consider like a 1x developer or a more junior developer into more of a 5x or get closer to a 10x developer. They're basically cutting out all of or at least attempting to cut out all of the wasted time between learning languages and frameworks, and then you having to use Stack Overflow to figure out how you do different things, and really assisting you in becoming more highly efficient as you write code. And then on the Auto GPT side, you could take these language learning models or large language models, and you could chain them together with other plugins to actually execute on tasks, not just give you feedback. And so if you can start to think of the way these things are being used and you can apply them in your world, imagine taking a large language model and various plugins to your security products, training them on your internal network, also training them on external data sources from either your vendors or the open internet. And you could start to think about how you can take a 1x SOC analyst and take them to a 10x, right? So they could start using, instead of having to learn complex Splunk query language, they could use human terms to be able to evaluate an incident or their environment or do threat hunting in an incredibly fast and highly accurate way over time. And I think we're going to start seeing that. I think Google released something that's geared towards this type of mentality. But there's just endless possibilities to just make the human in cybersecurity a lot more efficient using these technologies.
This is the wingman, right? I've heard it called the wingman. We're going to have a wingman, and somebody made a comment last week in a conference. Was this going to be the man eventually? But anyways, we're not in the man, we're in the wingman. They're going to be our friends for a while.
And I think it will fulfill over time the original promise of SOAR, orchestration automation.
Yeah, what I was going to pile on there is normally with software you have to pick from the three things of fast, cheap, and good, but you only get two. And when it comes to AI-powered systems, you really should demand all three. That's the real difference here. And so what we've seen with customers is we're able to take that low-level SOC analyst and let them behave at a much higher level. We've seen 20x. Customers have come and said publicly, hey, we're handling 20 times the amount of our environment prior to adoption of MixMode, because it's able to understand the environment automatically. It's able to alert, triage things and say, based on what we're seeing, you should look at this, not that. It's finding things before CVEs and IOCs are available. So when Log4j came out, alerting on things prior to it happening. So getting prepared for the next one, which is going to be Log5j. That's, you need to have tools that are able to understand that environment, do it at scale, and also bring that to your team in order for them to be more efficient, because there's just not enough analysts out there. So we need to get more from the teams that we have. And generally speaking, these technologies are as much about turning the 1x into a 10x, it's also to turn the 10x into a 100x, right? Taking your exquisitely trained operators and having them perform at a level that you couldn't believe before, because they're able to very quickly apply their expertise, right? It's been said you're not going to be replaced by AI, but you're going to be replaced by someone who uses AI, right? We're at that level of it's time to understand how these tools can be used, how they can be adopted, and if you are ahead of the game in incorporating them into the way that you are able to practice, then you're going to be vastly more successful. And to the question about how the bad guys are using this stuff, the NSA already said, not only is it about generating new types of attacks, it's about taking what's known to be successful and changing the signatures and saying, hey, let's just bypass all the CVEs and IOCs. That's a nightmare, right? If you are relying on either existing rules and CVEs and IOCs in your environment, which you absolutely should have, that's good hygiene, but you're going to need something else in order to handle the new stuff, or now in this case, the more modified components. And that's what these tools are able to do for the bad guys.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Yeah, the way I look at that is that the second that the red team gets the AI, everything's a 0 day. Everything's a 0 day.
Okay.
All the signatures will be unique, all the attack vectors will be unique, and all of those things will come into play and overlap. And when you start looking at that to where it's not a signature-based attack any longer, that everything is new, that's where you have to make sure that your tooling is adaptable and understanding that this is going to be a multifaceted attack with completely different signature bases, completely different vectors, and everyone will be new.
It's already happening in terms of the barrier to, if you're an attacker, right, the barrier for you to be able to execute attacks has been easier and easier. You're already seeing people using things like ChatGPT.
The woman in Darkness did her walkthrough of that or something.
Yeah, you're gonna see a lot more of this, right? So similarly to how you 1x to 10x a SOC analyst, you could do the same thing on the adversarial side. And there are open source packages around adversarial attacking that have been released by companies like IBM and Microsoft for the purposes of doing purple team type testing. But similar to what we've all seen happen with legitimate software like Cobalt Strike, the attackers are going to use these frameworks and these capabilities for bad things.
And one data point to throw out there is that where we sit right now, about 80% of successful attacks are powered by these novel attacks, things that are designed to bypass rules and IOCs. They're about half of the volume of attacks, to your point, where you can get kits off the shelf and script kiddies can just make it up in volume, but it's about 80% of successful attacks are out there. And if you think about it, of course they would be. The bad guys have access to the exact same signatures. They understand how ML can be bypassed, which is very static, and it's not the same thing as AI. And so that's only going to accelerate. Taking the mindset that I have my IOCs, I have my rules, I'm good, is not sufficient, right? It's good hygiene, you should do it, but it's not going to stop it.
We talked a little bit, right? What's AI, a high level risk, kind of use cases that we're going to see in our industry, and then a little bit about the MITRE, Atlas, and other frameworks. So what's next? If people are here, they know it's coming for them, maybe in their business or their vendors. I think it's what you're going to rely on vendors even more now to do a lot of things for you that are going to have the sophistication of their technologies. People like yourselves, right, that are offering these really cool processes and technologies. So how do we educate? What's the recommendations? How to educate? What should people know here in this room, right? Cybersecurity professionals. What's next? Like tangible bites of information that we could give to our audience.
I'll start off with a little bit. I mentioned earlier, institutions are getting a lot of pressure, as I mentioned, to basically close the gap between curriculum instruction and employers' needs, right? There is a lot of funding that's being generated either by the NSF, NIH, even NIST themselves, in order to make an impact at institutions to change the curriculum, right? Most recently, we have something called the Adam Institute, adam.fiu.edu, that has a group of faculty members that are changing the way we're developing bachelor's degrees in computer science, master's of science in electrical engineering or civil engineering. And now there are concentrations within this space that make our students career ready. To the point that even in our recent accreditation process, we have something called Quality Enhancement Plan that I mentioned again earlier, that basically talks about the 3 areas: emotional intelligence, AI, and how to basically communicate and understand data. We need to make an impactful change at the core level of students coming in, and there's even institutions across the country, Berkeley is one, UC San Diego's and another, that there is a form of AI that has to be taught in every discipline across the institution. Even if you're a psychology major, even if you're a sociology major, the fact that they could engage and understand the biasness that's being created with things like ChatGPT, they have a role within the technology stack to basically give input on how those outputs are being generated. I think that people only think it's tech related, but there is a lot on the social sciences side that also needs to be engaged, and institutions like FIU are trying to make that impact as well.
Thank you.
So I think that where we're at with AI and ML right now is a platform shift on the order of public cloud and probably on the order of mobile. Honestly, my biggest piece of advice is when you go through these types of platform shifts, which we've all been through, we've all adapted to, you need to think of the same way that you adapted to those over time, right? And it really comes down to educating yourself to give you a good fundamental base of knowledge to be seen as credible. And again, I couldn't stress more, you do not need to be a data scientist to understand this space. It feels like that a lot of times, even for myself and others who have been focused on this over the last several years. My biggest piece of advice is just go get your hands in the technology. If you haven't used ChatGPT, if you haven't used AutoGPT, if you haven't messed around with these technologies, you really should be thinking about doing that, because that's what will help you build your credibility so that you can speak to it within your organization. And the second piece of advice that I would give is it's very likely that all of your organizations are running some tools and technologies that are leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning today. Have you really thought through the risk of using those types of technologies as the threat actors become more sophisticated in AI and ML? What happens if your technology is exposed to some sort of an invasion attack or data poisoning? That is a risk that is directly transferred to you. So start to think about that in your threat model. Start to think about that in your supply chain security.
Yeah, one of the things that we talk about is from this point forward, getting these types of technologies integrated into society, they need to achieve what actually the National Security Commission on AI called was justified confidence. And to your point, you don't need a PhD in this stuff. You don't have to go to the whiteboard and do the math. But you have to have that level of, I understand intrinsically what this is doing. I'm not going to just take its word for it, right? ChatGPT is sometimes right, but never in doubt is kind of part of the problem. And so having that confidence that I understand either how to utilize it, how to apply it to different types of technologies, what it's good at. Again, that foundational model, foundational approach, large language models for what I think are going to replace a lot of the query languages. We're probably going to be using English as the #1 English for programming and querying languages. That's what it's going to be good at. But as far as detecting what's going on in your network, approaches like ours are going to be much better suited for that. And so when you use the right tool for the right job, you're going to have a good outcome.
So I think to recap, I think we're on time here, right? I don't want to overexceed time. I think it's a lot of information, right? But we get an understanding of AI from a model fundamental perspective, the risk, right? How are you protecting against your risk? And it's just your risk internally if you're using these models yourself. So if you're developing products and you're a software development or technology company, that definitely affects you directly. But as a consumer of many organizations that are going to use products that use this, your vendor security, I feel, is very important. What are they doing? I think frameworks from like certifications are way behind the ball. They need to catch up with some of these things. And then educate yourself, I think is one of the big things you mentioned. Educate, and there's going to be, like you said, societal impacts, social studies, psychology. We're not going to get into that here, but I thought you guys were great. I thank you for all the information, and we want to open it now for questions. I know I went to a panel a few weeks ago on AI, and the guy had a huge line afterwards. I don't know, we're going to have that here, but please chime in if you have questions. So thank you. Thank you.